They say, "What's said is said," as if words leave the mouth and evaporate like morning fog. But some words do not evaporate. Some sentences stay behind, like ash after a fire, settling quietly in the mind, long after everyone else has gone home. A conversation ends. The room changes. The day continues. And yet, later, in the middle of a shower, or while staring at a ceiling that refuses to answer back, that one moment returns. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was unclear. Because it carried a pause that felt like judgment. A smile that felt like a mask. A sure that didn't sound sure. Why does the mind replay what already ended? Why do certain voices echo louder than your own? And why can a normal moment feel like a private trial, with evidence you can't stop collecting? This is one of the quietest modern epidemics, the compulsion to rewind. Not for entertainment, just for safety. Some conversations close like a door, clean, final, unremarkable. But some close like a door that doesn't fully latch. It looks shut, yet something keeps slipping through the crack. A sentence repeats itself while brushing teeth. A facial expression returns while folding laundry. A laugh becomes suspicious, then heavier, then strangely personal. And the replay begins. At first, it feels responsible. Like proofreading a message before sending it, only the message is already gone. Only the recipient has already walked away. Only the moment is already sealed in the past. Still, the mind insists, check again. It zooms in on tone, on timing, on the half-second where the other person looked away, on the silence that followed your words, an empty space the brain refuses to leave empty. And if you try to explain it to someone who doesn't experience it, it can sound almost silly. It wasn't that deep. They probably forgot. Just move on. But the mind that replays isn't trying to be deep. It's trying to be safe. Because the social world is not just social. It is belonging. It is access. It is warmth. It is the difference between being inside a circle and being left at the edge, smiling like you don't mind. So the replay becomes a ritual. You replay to see if you were rude without noticing. You replay to see if you overshared. You replay to see if your joke landed wrong. You replay to see if you interrupted too much. You replay to see if your face looked strange. You replay because the mind has an old belief that rarely gets spoken out loud. If the social world is misunderstood, something precious could be lost. And the hardest part is that replaying doesn't always happen after conflict. Sometimes it happens after warmth. A good conversation can still be replayed like a crime scene, because the nervous system doesn't measure good. It measures stable. Was the warmth real, or temporary? Was the closeness secure, or borrowed? Was the smile a welcome, or a polite curtain? This is why some people can receive affection and still feel unsettled. Because the mind is not looking for kindness. It is looking for certainty. In psychology, repetitive dwelling has a name: rumination, excessive, repetitive thinking that can interfere with other mental activity. The word sounds clinical, but the lived experience is tender. It is the mind trying to finish something it experienced as unfinished. Not a task. A meaning. And meaning is slippery. Meaning hides in eyes, pauses, micro-expressions, shifts in tone. Meaning is a shadow you can't hold, so the mind tries to trap it with analysis. Visual, close-up B-roll of a phone screen dimming, reflections in a window at night. Sometimes you lie in bed and your mind plays the conversation back with a cruel kind of clarity. Your words sound louder than they did in real life. Your mistakes look bigger. Their face looks more judgmental. Even the background feels sharper, because the brain edits memories the way a worried director edits a film. It keeps the frames that hurt and cuts the ones that don't. And then, quietly, the replay turns into something else. Not what happened, but what's wrong with you. Some people replay conversations because their minds grew up in a climate where small mistakes were not small. A wrong tone could change the whole day. A misunderstood comment could become a lecture. A harmless opinion could be met with silence, cold, stretched, punishing. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it was gentle, even polite. A parent who smiled in public but withdrew in private. A caregiver whose love felt warm, until it suddenly wasn't. A household where affection could vanish without explanation, like sunlight behind thick clouds. Or a classroom where embarrassment arrived quickly, where one wrong answer became a story told for weeks. Where laughter wasn't joy. It was social punishment dressed like fun. In those places, the social world was not just social. It was weather. And a child learns to predict weather. A child learns that safety does not come from being real. Safety comes from being accurate. Accurate about what people want. Accurate about what people mean. Accurate about what can be said, and what will cost too much. So the mind becomes a careful listener. Not the kind that listens to understand. The kind that listens to survive. This is how replaying begins, as a skill. A hidden kind of intelligence that develops in emotionally uncertain spaces. Hyper-attunement, micro-reading, the ability to notice tiny shifts in mood like a sailor watching the horizon. And at some point, the mind makes a deal with itself. If everything is analyzed, nothing will blindside you. That deal sounds protective. But it has a price. Because the adult body still carries the child's fear of sudden consequences. So even safe conversations can feel high stakes, because the nervous system remembers an older world, where connection could disappear like a chair pulled away mid-sit. And this is where society's myth becomes especially cruel. Stop overthinking. You're too sensitive. You care too much. But the truth is quieter. Some people were trained to care this much. Trained by unpredictability. Trained by conditional warmth. Trained by the subtle threat that being wrong might cost closeness. So later, as an adult, the mind keeps scanning, because it still believes love is something that can be lost with one sentence. That is why replaying can happen even after a good conversation. Because good doesn't always feel secure. A compliment can feel like a fragile candle. A neutral expression can feel like wind. So the mind watches. Then re-watches. Like someone returning to the same well, hoping the next look will finally reveal whether it is safe to drink. And underneath all the analysis is a question that rarely gets admitted. Is closeness stable? Or is it temporary? The human brain is not designed for peace. It is designed for prediction. It keeps a running map of what leads to belonging, and what leads to exile. And because belonging once meant survival, the brain takes social information seriously, even when modern life pretends it's not a big deal. Rumination often feels like problem-solving. But many mental loops don't solve. They tighten. Rumination is often described as repetitive dwelling on distress and its causes and consequences. That word, dwelling, matters. Because replaying conversations often doesn't move toward clarity. It moves toward more questions. And the questions tend to lean in one direction. Not, did that go okay? But, what did you do wrong? This isn't because you are broken. It is because the brain carries a bias. Negative information weighs more. Adults display a negativity bias, the tendency to attend to and use negative information more than positive information. So one uncertain look can feel heavier than 10 comfortable minutes. One ambiguous pause can erase an entire evening of laughter. And ambiguity is especially sticky. A direct insult is painful, but simple. A direct compliment is warm, but clear. But the half compliment, the unclear pause, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. Those are the moments that remain open, like a book left face down, marked by a crease the mind keeps touching. The mind treats uncertainty like unfinished business. The Zeigarnik effect is often described as the tendency for unfinished, interrupted activity to hold a privileged place in memory. In the social world, unfinished often means uncertain. Was that sarcasm? Was that annoyance? Was that boredom? Was that disappointment? So the mind replays to close the loop. But here is the quiet tragedy. The loop often cannot be closed from the inside. Because you cannot re-enter the other person's mind. You cannot retrieve their exact meaning. You can only imagine it. And imagination, under stress, rarely paints gentle pictures. So the replay becomes a film edited by fear. A director that cuts out the neutral scenes and keeps only the awkward frames. You remember the moment you stumbled on a word, but not the moment they smiled right after. You remember the second you felt exposed, but not the minutes you were simply human. And the more you replay, the more the memory changes shape, because memory is not a museum exhibit. It's more like river sediment. Every time you touch the water, the bottom shifts a little. Visual, slow-motion water ripples, sand rising and falling. And after enough replays, the conversation no longer feels like what happened. It feels like what you fear it meant. Music. Replaying conversations is rarely just about the conversation. It is about your place in the human circle. Your permission to belong. And the emotion guarding that doorway is often shame. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that wears professional clothing. Shame can disguise itself as being humble, as wanting to do better, as holding yourself accountable. So the mind returns to the interaction and begins the interrogation. Why did you say that? Why didn't you say this instead? Why did your voice change? Why did you laugh like that? Why did you pause there? It sounds like analysis, but it can feel like a sentence. Because shame doesn't simply ask, was that effective? Shame asks, was that acceptable? And that question has teeth. It carries old memories, being corrected too sharply, being laughed at, being ignored after speaking, being told, directly or indirectly, that your presence requires adjustment. So when you replay, the mind isn't just replaying words. It is replaying a fear. That being real might cost love. This is why replaying can happen after tiny moments, after a casual chat with a coworker, after a small joke in a group, after a message that ended with a normal emoji. Because shame doesn't need big reasons. It only needs uncertainty. And then it begins its craft, turning uncertainty into self-blame, because self-blame feels like control. If it was your fault, then it can be fixed. If it was your fault, then next time you can be perfect. And if you can be perfect, maybe you can finally relax. But perfection is not relaxation. Perfection is a cage made of polished bars. So the mind starts managing your identity like a brand. It audits your words. It reviews your tone. It checks your facial expressions in memory like security footage. It imagines alternate timelines where you were smoother, calmer, more impressive, less, too much. And every alternate timeline is a quiet confession. The real you feels risky. So the mind punishes the past to protect the future. But protection can become cruelty when it forgets the difference between safety and control. And beneath all of it is something heartbreakingly simple. Was I okay? Was I too much? Was I embarrassing? Did I lose something without noticing? Inside the mind that replays conversations, there are often two selves. One self wants to let it go, to return to the body, to feel the softness of an evening without dragging a social autopsy into bed. And the other self says, not yet. Not because it enjoys suffering, because it has a job. Its job is to prevent future pain by rechecking past danger. So even when you tell yourself it went fine, something doesn't believe it. Because the mind does not trust calm statements. The mind trusts patterns. And if your past taught you that things can change without warning, that warmth can vanish. That affection can cool overnight. Then the protective self stays awake. This is why reassurance can feel temporary while doubt feels convincing. A friend says, they probably didn't mean anything by it. And for a moment, your shoulders drop. Then the mind returns, quietly, with another possibility. But what if they did? That what if is not curiosity. It is a flare sent up from an older fear, and then something else happens. You begin to fear being perceived. Not in a dramatic way. In a subtle way. You walk away from a conversation and feel exposed. Like your personality is still on display somewhere, being evaluated. Like a stain you can't see but can't stop imagining. This is where post-event processing becomes a trap for some people, especially those prone to social anxiety. Post-event rumination shows a moderate relationship with social anxiety across the spectrum. But even without naming any label, the lived experience is simple. Some minds cannot rest after being seen. Because being seen once carried consequences. So the two selves fight. The tired self says, "Please stop." The protective self says, "If you stop, you'll miss the clue that saves you next time." And the more exhausted you become, the harsher the inner voice can sound, because exhaustion makes compassion harder to access. So replaying becomes chains you can't see. Not dramatic chains. Quiet chains. The kind that keep you functioning, while slowly draining the warmth from your inner life. And somewhere underneath both selves is a longing that has not been named yet. Not to be perfect. Not to be impressive. Just to be safe while being human. A mind that replays conversations is often described as overthinking. But that word can be unfairly flat. Because the replay is not always about thought. It is about threat. Not the threat of danger in the street. The threat of danger in the bond. The possibility that closeness is more fragile than it looks. So the rewind is really asking for something that should have been normal. Clarity. Consistency. A stable signal that says, "You are still welcome here." And when that signal is missing, or when your nervous system cannot fully trust it, your mind tries to manufacture it through analysis. It replays because it is searching for the moment where safety changed. Like fingers tracing a crack in a wall, trying to find where the structure became unstable. It is not just the words. It is the temperature of the interaction. A warm tone is like sunlight. A cool tone is like shade. And if you grew up having to chase sunlight, you may notice shade more quickly than others do. Not because you are dramatic, but because your body remembers what shade once meant. Distance, disapproval, emotional scarcity. That is why certain conversations echo like a volcano that didn't erupt, but threatened to. Nothing happened, but something could have happened. And the nervous system treats, could have, like, did. So the mind returns to the scene, trying to understand what was unsaid. Was there hidden annoyance? Was there disappointment under politeness? Was there a silent verdict? And even when the other person had no verdict at all, your mind may still create one, because uncertainty is an empty well, and the mind hates emptiness. It drops buckets down into the dark, again and again, hoping to hear the sound of water. Hoping to find something solid. But the deeper need isn't information. It is emotional permission. Permission to have awkward moments and still be loved. Permission to misspeak and still be safe. Permission to be imperfect without being abandoned. That is the turning point that changes the meaning of the replay. If the rewind is asking for safety, then the person replaying is not shallow, not weak, not too sensitive. They are someone who learned that belonging is a condition to be maintained, not a home to be lived in. So the mind keeps cleaning the floor of the past, scrubbing at footprints that might not even be there, because it believes cleanliness is the price of staying inside. But you were never meant to earn your place through mental labor. You were meant to be human. Music. Some echoes do not disappear because the mind is stubborn. Some echoes stay because they carry meaning. When you replay conversations, it can feel like the mind is betraying you, pulling you away from the present, stirring old sediment back into clear water. But sometimes replaying is simply the mind trying to return to a moment that felt emotionally unfinished. A moment where you wanted to be understood. A moment where you wanted to be safe. A moment where you wanted to be held, subtly, invisibly, through someone's tone, someone's attention, someone's steadiness. And when that steadiness feels uncertain, the echo continues. Yet there is another truth, quieter than the loop. Not every unanswered social moment is a problem to solve. Sometimes a pause is just a pause. Sometimes a look away is just fatigue. Sometimes sure is just sure. Sometimes people are rivers too, carrying their own storms, their own debris, without it being about you. But the mind that replays does not always accept that, because it learned a painful rule. If you assume innocence and you are wrong, you get hurt. So it assumes danger, because danger feels safer than surprise. And this is where gentleness matters. Because harshness feeds the loop. Harshness makes the brain grip tighter. But gentleness loosens the fist around the memory. You cannot always stop the mind from producing echoes. But the echo does not have to become a verdict. A replay can be recognized as a signal. Not that you failed, but that your system is still scanning for belonging. And if you have ever felt embarrassed by how much you replay, if you have ever thought, why can't you just be normal? Then something deserves to be said softly. Replaying is often a sign that you care about people, that you notice, that you want to love cleanly, and be loved cleanly. The tragedy is not the sensitivity. The tragedy is that sensitivity had to become armor. And armor is heavy. So if the echo is here tonight, let it be seen for what it is. A nervous system asking for steadiness. A heart asking not to be punished for being alive. Visual, slow sunrise through curtains, dust floating in warm light. If this reflection made you feel seen, if parts of it felt familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, let that recognition be soft. Replaying conversations can feel isolating, like living with a secret habit nobody else would understand. But it is far more common than it looks. And it often grows in people who had to become careful, perceptive, and socially awake. Sometimes too early, sometimes for too long. Nothing here is meant to label you. Nothing here is meant to diagnose you. Only to name a pattern with compassion, so it doesn't have to stay hidden in shame. If you'd like to stay connected, a gentle subscription is always there. Not as a demand, but as a quiet way to return to this kind of psychological space. A place where the hidden corners of the human heart are explored with patience, not judgment. And if you feel safe to share, comments are open, optional, always. A single sentence about what your mind replays, or what you wish someone had said to you after a hard social moment, might help another person feel less alone in their own late-night echo. You deserve gentleness.